Jake Morrison stood at attention outside the royal chambers, his boots polished and his uniform pressed to perfection, though he knew that none of the Sylvari guards around him cared about such things. They barely noticed him at all, treating him like a decorative statue rather than a trained security officer. He had been stationed on the Sylvari homeworld for 6 months now, serving as the only human member of Queen Valanthi's personal protection detail. And in all that time he had never once been asked for his opinion, never been included in security briefings, and never been trusted with anything more important than standing in hallways and looking official. The assignment had come as a surprise to everyone back on Earth, including Jake himself. When the Galactic Union had announced the new alliance between humanity and the Sylvari Empire, someone in the diplomatic corps had decided that a human presence in the Queen's Guard would send a powerful message of unity and cooperation. What that message actually said, Jake had come to realize, was that humans were useful for symbolic gestures, but not much else. The Sylvari were an ancient species, far older than humanity, and they had built their empire through careful negotiation and sophisticated diplomacy, rather than through war or conquest. Their lavender skin seemed to glow softly in the ambient light of the palace, and their 4 slender arms moved with a grace that made every gesture look like a dance. They were beautiful, intelligent, and deeply peaceful, and they regarded humans the way a scholar might regard a clever but somewhat unpredictable animal, with curiosity, perhaps even affection, but certainly not with respect. Commander Sorathan, the tall and imposing head of the Vanthir Guard, had made the situation perfectly clear on Jake's first day at the palace. "You are here because your government requested it, and because our queen wishes to honor the alliance," Sorathan had said, his silver eyes cold and distant. "But make no mistake, human, you are not one of us, and you never will be. The Vanthir have protected the royal family for 3,000 years, and we do not need help from a species that discovered space travel only 2 centuries ago." Jake had simply nodded and accepted his position without complaint. He was a professional, and professionals did their jobs regardless of how they were treated. But Queen Valanthi herself was different. She was older than she appeared, having ruled the Sylvari Empire for more than 60 years, though her face remained smooth and her movements remained fluid. Her silver eyes held a depth of wisdom that Jake found both intimidating and fascinating, and unlike her guards, she seemed genuinely interested in the human assigned to protect her. "Tell me about Earth," she had said during one of their first conversations, her voice musical and soft. "I have read the histories and studied the data, but I want to understand what it means to be human. Your species is so young, and yet you have accomplished so much in such a short time. How is this possible?" Jake had struggled to find an answer that would satisfy a being who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. "We're stubborn, Your Majesty," he had finally said, "and we don't know when to quit. Every time something tried to wipe us out, we just got back up and kept going." The queen had tilted her head, her 4 hands folded elegantly in her lap, and studied him with those ancient silver eyes. "Fascinating," she had murmured. "Your species treats persistence as a virtue, while mine has always valued wisdom and patience. Perhaps there is something we can learn from each other." Those conversations had become a regular occurrence, and Jake found himself looking forward to them, despite the disapproval of Commander Sorathan and the other Vanthir guards. The Queen asked endless questions about human history, human culture, and human nature, and Jake answered as honestly as he could. He told her about the wars that had nearly destroyed his species, about the plagues that had killed millions, about the ice ages and natural disasters that had pushed humanity to the edge of extinction again and again. He told her about the heroes who had risen in those dark times, ordinary people who had refused to surrender even when all hope seemed lost. And he told her about the bond that humans formed with those they chose to protect, a bond that went deeper than duty or obligation. "We call it loyalty," Jake explained one evening as the twin moons of the Sylvari homeworld rose in the purple sky. "And once a human gives their loyalty to someone, nothing in the universe can break it. Not fear, not pain, not even death." The Queen had been silent for a long moment after that, her expression unreadable. "The Sylvari do not have a word for such a concept," she had finally admitted. "Our culture values the survival of the species above all else. Individuals come and go, but the Empire endures. This is the foundation of everything we believe." Jake had nodded, understanding the philosophy, even if he could not embrace it. "Humans believe in that too, Your Majesty," he had said. "But we also believe that the way we survive matters just as much as survival itself. There are some lines we will not cross, some prices we will not pay, no matter the cost." Those words would come back to haunt him sooner than he could have imagined. The Kareth Dominion had been growing more aggressive with each passing month, their warships prowling the borders of Sylvari space like hungry predators waiting for a sign of weakness. The reptilian conquerors had already swallowed 3 smaller civilizations, adding their worlds and resources to the ever-expanding Dominion. Intelligence reports suggested that the Kareth viewed the Sylvari as soft targets, wealthy and advanced, but utterly incapable of defending themselves. The alliance with Earth had given them pause. But everyone knew that humanity's small fleet was stationed too far away to provide meaningful protection. Jake watched the political situation deteriorate with growing concern, but the Vanthyr guards seemed almost serene in their confidence. The Kareth would not dare attack the homeworld, Sorathan had declared, at a security briefing, that Jake was permitted to observe, but not participate in. Such an action would unite the entire Galactic Union against them. They are conquerors, not fools. Jake had wanted to point out that conquerors throughout history had done plenty of foolish things when they smelled weakness. But he knew that his opinion would not be welcome. So he stood at his post, day after day, watching and waiting, and hoping that his instincts were wrong. The Festival of Twin Moons was approaching, the most sacred celebration in Sylvari culture, and the entire capital city was preparing for a week of music, art, and ceremony. The palace would be filled with visitors, the streets would be crowded with revelers, and security would be stretched thin across the entire planet. It was the perfect time for an enemy to strike. Jake Morrison checked his weapon for the 100th time and settled into his position outside the royal chambers, knowing in his gut that something was coming, something that all the wisdom and patience of the Sylvari would not be able to stop. He was only one human, alone and underestimated, in a galaxy that did not believe in him. But he had made a promise to protect the Queen, and Jake Morrison always kept his promises. The Festival of Twin Moons filled the capital city with light and music and the laughter of thousands. And from his position in the palace, Jake could hear the celebrations echoing through the ancient stone corridors, like the heartbeat of an entire civilization. Colored lanterns floated through the night sky, released by Sylvari families to honor their ancestors, and the twin moons hung fat and golden above the festivities, bathing everything in a warm glow that made the purple towers of the city look like they had been carved from gemstones. It was beautiful, Jake had to admit. Perhaps the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. But beauty did not stop him from checking his weapon every few minutes, or from scanning the shadows with eyes trained to spot threats that others would miss. Queen Valenthe was inside her private study, reviewing security reports with Commander Sorathan, and the other Vanthyr guards had taken positions throughout the palace, in what they considered an adequate defensive formation. Jake thought there were too many gaps, too many blind spots, too many places where an enemy could slip through undetected, but when he had tried to raise his concerns earlier that day, Sorathan had dismissed him with a wave of his 4 hands. "The palace has stood for 5,000 years, the commander had said, his tone dripping with condescension. and it will stand for 5,000 more. We do not need advice from a species that still builds with wood and stone. So Jake kept his concerns to himself, and maintained his position outside the Queen's study, listening to the distant music and watching the shadows with growing unease. The first sign that something was wrong came when the music stopped. Not gradually, not fading away as one song ended and another began, but suddenly, completely, as if someone had thrown a switch and silenced the entire city at once. Jake's hand went to his weapon before his mind had even processed what was happening. Then the lights went out. The palace plunged into darkness so complete that Jake could not see his own hands in front of his face. And for a long, terrible moment, there was nothing but silence and blackness and the pounding of his own heart. Emergency lighting flickered to life a few seconds later, casting everything in a dim red glow that turned the elegant corridors into something out of a nightmare, and Jake's communicator exploded with panicked voices overlapping each other in a chaos of fear and confusion. Breach in the eastern wall. Multiple contacts in Sector 7. They're everywhere. The transmission cut off with a scream that Jake would remember for the rest of his life. He burst through the door to the Queen's study without waiting for permission, and found Commander Sorathen already on his feet, his silver eyes wide with fear, and his four hands trembling as he barked orders into his communicator. Queen Volanti stood near the window, her face pale and her expression frozen in shock, watching as fires began to bloom in the city below. "What's happening?" Jake demanded, his weapon drawn and ready. Sorathen barely glanced at him, before returning his attention to the desperate reports flooding in from across the palace. "Korath strike teams," the commander said, his voice cracking with stress. "Of them. They infiltrated during the festival, and they're cutting through our defenses like they don't exist. This is a decapitation strike, human. They've come to kill the Queen." Jake positioned himself between the Queen and the door, his training taking over, even as his mind raced through possible escape routes and defensive options. "Then we hold this position until reinforcements arrive," he said. But Sorathen was not listening to him. The Vanthir commander was already gathering his 12 elite guards, and instead of forming a defensive perimeter around the Queen, they were moving toward the door. "What are you doing?" Jake asked, disbelief creeping into his voice. Sorathen finally met his eyes, and Jake saw something there that he had never expected to see in a warrior, the cold calculation of someone who had already accepted defeat. "The royal bloodline must survive," Sorathen said, his tone flat and emotionless. "Prince Veleron is being evacuated through the underground passages as we speak. He will continue the dynasty and lead our people through whatever comes next." "And the Queen?" "The Queen understands her duty," Sorathen replied, "as do we all. One death among many is acceptable if it ensures the survival of the Empire. This is the way of the Sylvari. This is how we have endured for millennia." Jake stared at the commander, at the 12 elite warriors who stood behind him, at the guards who were supposed to protect their queen with their lives, and he felt something dark and hot rising in his chest. "You're abandoning her," he said, the words coming out hard and sharp, like broken glass. "We are preserving what matters most," Sorathen corrected. "And if you were wise, human, you would come with us. There is nothing you can do here except die, and your death will accomplish nothing." Jake looked at Queen Volanthi, who had remained silent throughout this exchange, her silver eyes filled with a terrible mixture of betrayal and understanding. This was her culture, her people, and she had been raised from birth to accept that the survival of the Empire mattered more than any individual life, even her own. But accepting something and being at peace with it were not the same thing, and Jake could see the pain behind her mask of royal composure. He turned back to Sorathen and made his decision. "I'm staying," he said. The Vanthir commander stared at him for a long moment, and something flickered across his alien features. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe something closer to pity. "You will die for nothing," Sorathen said. "No," Jake replied, his voice steady and certain. "I'll die for something. I'll die doing my job. I'll die keeping my promise, and I'll die knowing that I didn't run when someone needed me." Sorathan held his gaze for what felt like an eternity, and then the moment passed, and the commander was moving, leading his guards out of the study and down the corridor toward the evacuation route, leaving Jake alone with the queen he had sworn to protect. The sound of their footsteps faded into silence, and then there was only the distant chaos of battle and the soft hum of emergency lighting. Queen Valanthe finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You should have gone with them," she said. "Sorathan is right. There is nothing you can do against the Korath. They are warriors bred for killing, and you are only one human." Jake checked his weapon and moved to secure the door, his mind already cataloging every entrance, every window, every possible point of attack. "With respect, Your Majesty," he said without looking at her, "I don't care what I can or can't do. I care about what I should do, and I should be standing right here, between you and anyone who wants to hurt you." He could feel her watching him, could sense her trying to understand this strange creature from a young and reckless species who would throw away his life for someone he barely knew. "Why?" she asked, and the question held the weight of a civilization trying to comprehend something utterly foreign to everything it believed. Jake finally turned to face her, and despite the fear and the chaos and the death that was coming for them both, he smiled. "Because that's what humans do, Your Majesty," he said. "We stand up for each other, we fight for each other, and we don't leave anyone behind, ever." The first sounds of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor, heavy and deliberate, and nothing like the graceful movements of the Sylvari. The Korath were coming. Jake Morrison raised his weapon and prepared to show them exactly what one could do. Human could do. The first Korath assassin came through the window in an explosion of shattered glass, his scaled body twisting through the air with a grace that belied his massive size. And Jake put 2 rounds into his chest before his clawed feet touched the floor. The reptilian warrior crumpled without a sound, and Jake was already moving, repositioning himself to cover the next point of entry, while Queen Valanthe pressed herself against the far wall, with her 4 hands clasped against her chest. "Stay behind me," Jake ordered, his voice calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "And if I tell you to run, you run without looking back." The queen nodded, her silver eyes wide and fixed on the dead Korath, and Jake realized that she'd probably never seen anyone killed before. The Sylvari had removed themselves from violence so completely that even their monarch had no concept of what it meant to watch someone die. There was no time to comfort her, because the second assassin was already dropping from the ventilation shaft in the ceiling, his blade aimed at Jake's throat, and Jake had to twist sideways and meet the attack with his combat knife. They collided in a tangle of limbs and steel, and for a few desperate seconds, Jake fought for his life against a creature that outweighed him by 50 pounds and had been engineered for killing since birth. But humans had been fighting things bigger and stronger than themselves since the dawn of their species, and Jake had trained for this exact situation more times than he could count. He found an opening and drove his knife into the soft tissue beneath the Korath's jaw, and the assassin collapsed with a gurgling hiss that sprayed warm blood across Jake's face. 2 down. The third and 4th came through the door together, shoulder to shoulder, their weapons raised, and their eyes burning with predatory hunger, and Jake emptied half his magazine into them before they could take 3 steps into the room. The 5th was smarter, using the bodies of his fallen comrades as cover while he advanced, and Jake had to close the distance and engage in hand-to-hand combat that left him with a deep gash across his ribs, and the 5th assassin dead on the floor with a broken neck. Jake pressed his free hand against the wound and felt warm blood seeping between his fingers. But there was no time to tend to it, because more footsteps were approaching, and the night was far from over. "We need to move," he told the queen, grabbing her arm with his bloody hand and pulling her toward a servant's entrance hidden behind a tapestry. "They know where we are now, and staying in one place will get us killed." Queen Valanthe stumbled after him, her graceful movements abandoned in favor of survival, and together they plunged into the narrow corridors that ran through the walls of the ancient palace like veins through a body. Jake had spent his months of boredom memorizing every inch of the building, every forgotten passage and hidden room, every shortcut and dead end. He had done it because he was a professional, and professionals prepared for every possibility, even the ones that seemed impossible. Now that preparation was the only thing keeping them alive. They moved through the darkness, with Jake in the lead, his weapon raised and his senses straining for any sign of pursuit. And the queen followed in silence, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floors. Behind them, the sounds of violence echoed through the palace, screams and gunfire, and the crash of breaking doors as the Korath swept through room after room in search of their target. "How many?" Valanthe whispered, her voice trembling with fear she could not hide. "Doesn't matter," Jake replied. "We survive this 1 minute at a time, one step at a time, one breath at a time. That's how humans have always done it." They emerged into a storage room filled with forgotten furniture and dust-covered crates, and Jake allowed himself a moment to check his weapon and assess the damage to his body. The cut across his ribs was deep but not fatal, though it would slow him down if he lost too much blood. He tore a strip from his uniform and bound the wound as tightly as he could, gritting his teeth against the pain. Queen Valanthe watched him with an expression he could not read. "I have studied your species for decades," she said softly. "I thought I understood what you were, but I was wrong. Watching you fight is like watching something from a nightmare, something that refuses to die no matter how many times it is struck down." Jake finished the makeshift bandage and checked the corridor outside the storage room. "On Earth, we have animals called cockroaches," he said, allowing himself a small smile despite the situation. "They've been around for 300 million years, and they've survived everything the planet has thrown at them because they're too stubborn and too resilient to give up. Humans are the same way. We've been knocked down 1,000 times, and 1,000 times we've gotten back up." "But why?" the queen asked, and Jake could hear the genuine confusion in her voice. "My guards made the logical choice. They preserved the royal bloodline and ensured the continuation of the empire. Why would you choose to stay and die when you could have chosen to survive?" Jake was quiet for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of the Korath hunters and calculating their next move. "Because survival isn't everything," he finally said. "Because there are things worth dying for, and protecting the people who depend on us is one of them. My species learned a long time ago that the way we live matters just as much as whether we live. If we abandon each other when things get hard, then what's the point of surviving at all?" The queen did not answer, but Jake could see something changing behind her silver eyes, something shifting in the way she looked at him and at the world around her. There was no time to explore that change because the sound of approaching footsteps told him that the Korath had found their trail. "Stay close," he said, and then they were moving again, deeper into the maze of forgotten passages, fighting and running and surviving 1 moment at a time. 3 more assassins found them before dawn, and 3 more assassins died at Jake's hands. He was wounded now in 6 places, his uniform soaked with blood, both his own and others, and every step sent pain shooting through his body like fire. But he kept moving, kept fighting, kept putting himself between the queen and the death that hunted them through the darkness. Queen Valanthe had stopped asking questions. She simply followed where he led, her silver eyes fixed on his back, watching as this single human defied everything she had ever believed about the nature of survival and sacrifice. And somewhere, in the long, terrible hours of that night, she began to understand what loyalty truly meant. The first light of dawn was creeping through the high windows of the palace, when Jake finally allowed himself to believe they might survive. He had lost count of how many Kareth assassins he had killed during the long night. 15, maybe 17. And his body had become a map of wounds and bruises that screamed for rest with every heartbeat. But they were still alive, both of them, and that was all that mattered. He had guided the queen to the inner sanctuary, the most defensible room in the entire palace, a chamber built centuries ago to protect the royal family during times of crisis. The walls were thick stone, reinforced with metal. The door was heavy enough to stop a charging vehicle, and there were no windows large enough for an adult Korith to fit through. It was as safe as anywhere could be on this terrible night. Jake leaned against the wall and allowed himself to breathe, allowed the exhaustion to wash over him for just a moment before forcing it back down. He checked his weapon and found 3 rounds remaining, barely enough to matter against what was still out there. Queen Volanthi sat on the stone floor across from him, her elegant robes stained with dust and blood, her silver eyes hollow with the weight of everything she had witnessed. "The sun is rising," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of fear and silence. In Sylvari culture, the dawn represents hope and renewal. It is said that no darkness can survive the coming of the light. Jake tried to smile, but found he lacked the energy. "On Earth, we have a similar saying," he replied. "We say that the darkest hour is just before the dawn. It means that things are always worst, right before they get better." He wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that the Korith would withdraw, now that their surprise attack had failed. Wanted to believe that help was on the way, and that the long night was finally over. But the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the sanctuary door told him that hope was premature. These footsteps were different from the others, slower, more deliberate, each impact echoing through the chamber like the beat of a war drum. And then a voice, deep and rumbling, and filled with dark amusement, spoke through the door. "I can smell your blood, human," the voice said. "I can smell your fear. You have killed many of my hunters tonight, and for that I am impressed. But the hunt is over now, and the prey will be claimed." Jake pushed himself away from the wall and raised his weapon, positioning himself between the door and the queen. "Who are you?" he called out, buying time while his mind raced through options that were running dangerously low. "I am Vrecken," the voice replied, "commander of this strike force and the finest warrior the Korith Dominion has ever produced. I killed 12 Vanthyr guards with my own claws tonight, and they screamed and begged for mercy before they died. Your Sylvari friends are not the warriors they once were, human, but you interest me. Come out and face me, and I will give you a death with honor." The door shuddered as something massive struck it from the other side, and Jake knew that the barrier would not hold for long. "Stay behind the pillar," he told the queen. "No matter what happens, stay hidden and stay quiet." Volanthi grabbed his arm with 2 of her hands, her grip surprisingly strong. "You cannot fight him," she said, urgency breaking through her exhaustion. "You are wounded and weakened, and you have almost no ammunition. This is suicide." Jake looked at her, this ancient and wise queen, who had ruled an empire while humanity was still learning to walk among the stars, and he felt a strange peace settle over him. "Maybe," he admitted, "but I'm not going to let him take you without a fight. That's not who I am, and it's not who humans are." The door burst inward, torn from its hinges by a creature that made the other Korith look like children. Vrecken was enormous, standing nearly 8 feet tall, with scales the color of dried blood, and eyes that burned with intelligent cruelty. His arms were thick with muscle, his claws were longer than knives, and his teeth were designed for tearing through flesh and bone. He stepped into the sanctuary and surveyed the scene with obvious pleasure. "One human," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "One wounded, exhausted human, standing between me and my prize. This is what the great alliance between Earth and the Sylvari amounts to." Jake raised his weapon and fired his last 3 rounds. 2 struck Vrecken in the chest, and 1 grazed his neck. But the massive Korath barely flinched. He looked down at the wounds, as if they were insect bites, then looked back at Jake with a smile that showed every one of his terrible teeth. "Impressive," Vrecken said. "Your weapons are effective, but not effective enough." He moved faster than something that large should be able to move, crossing the distance between them in a blur of scale and claw, and Jake had just enough time to raise his arm before the first blow sent him spinning across the room. He hit the wall hard enough to drive the breath from his lungs, and felt something crack in his chest, but he was already rolling aside as Vrecken's claws scraped against the stone where his head had been. Jake grabbed a broken piece of ceremonial armor from the floor and used it as an improvised blade, slashing at Vrecken's arm and drawing a line of dark blood across the scales. The Korath commander roared with surprise and anger, and the next blow caught Jake across the face and sent stars exploding through his vision. His vision! He went down hard, tasting blood, and forced himself back to his feet just in time to block another attack with the makeshift weapon. Vrecken was playing with him, Jake realized. The Korath was faster and stronger and could have ended the fight at any moment, but he was enjoying himself, savoring the opportunity to break this stubborn human piece by piece. "Why won't you stay down?" Vrecken snarled, genuine confusion mixing with his frustration, as Jake rose once more, swaying on legs that could barely support him. "Your species is weak, fragile, pathetic. You should be begging for mercy, not fighting back." Jake spat blood onto the floor and raised his weapon. "Humans don't beg," he said, his voice raw but steady, "and we don't know when to quit." He threw himself at Vrecken one more time, and the Korath caught him by the throat and lifted him off the ground, as easily as lifting a child. Jake's feet kicked uselessly in the air, as massive claws tightened around his windpipe, cutting off his oxygen and his life. "Disappointing," Vrecken said, leaning close so that Jake could see his own reflection in those burning eyes. "I expected more from the species that claims to never surrender. Perhaps your reputation is exaggerated." Jake's vision was going dark, his lungs screaming for air, his body failing one system at a time. He refused to look away from the monster that was killing him. And that was when Queen Valanthe moved. She came out from behind the pillar with a Korath blade in each of her 4 hands, weapons taken from the assassins Jake had killed during the long night. And her face was transformed by an emotion that the Sylvari had not felt in generations. Rage. Pure, burning, ancient rage at the injustice of what she was witnessing, at the cruelty of a universe that would destroy someone who had given everything to protect her. She drove 2 of the blades into Vrecken's back before he even knew she was there. The Korath commander screamed and dropped Jake, spinning to face this unexpected attack, and Valanthe plunged the other 2 blades into his chest with strength she did not know she possessed. Vrecken staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, and then he fell. Queen Valanthe of the Sylvari Empire stood over his body, silver eyes bright with tears, and somewhere deep inside her, something that had slept for millennia finally awakened. She had never held a weapon before that night. She would never forget how it felt to use one in defense of someone she cared about. Jake Morrison woke to the soft hum of medical equipment, and the gentle glow of Sylvari healing technology. His body wrapped in regenerative bandages that pulsed with warmth as they knitted his wounds back together. For a long moment, he simply lay there, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how he had ended up in this place. The last thing he recalled was the darkness closing in as Vrecken's claws tightened around his throat. And then nothing. Just an empty black void that he had been certain would last forever. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it, as pain shot through every part of his body that was capable of feeling pain. "You should rest," a familiar voice said from beside him, and Jake turned his head to find Queen Volanthi sitting in a chair next to his bed, her 4 hands folded in her lap, and her silver eyes watching him with an expression that was equal parts concern and something else he could not identify. "Your Majesty," Jake managed, his voice coming out as a harsh croak that made him wince. "What happened? The Korath? Are they?" "Gone," Volanthi said softly. "The strike force has been eliminated, and the Dominion has withdrawn its remaining ships from our borders. It seems that the failure of their assassination attempt has convinced them that attacking the Sylvari Empire is more costly than they anticipated." Jake let his head fall back against the pillow, relief flooding through him with an intensity that surprised him. "How long was I out?" he asked. 3 days, the Queen replied. "Your injuries were severe, and the healers were not certain you would survive. You had lost a great deal of blood, and several of your internal organs had been damaged. But you humans are remarkably resilient, it seems." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice had changed, becoming softer and heavier with emotion. "You should have died," she said. "By any logical calculation, you should have died a dozen times during that night. The odds against your survival were astronomical, and yet here you are." Jake managed a weak smile, despite the pain. "Humans are stubborn that way," he said, echoing words he had spoken to her what felt like a lifetime ago. The Queen was silent for a long moment, and Jake could see that she was struggling with something, wrestling with thoughts and feelings that were unfamiliar to her. "I killed someone," she finally said, and the words seemed to cost her something precious. "I took a life to save yours, and I do not know how to reconcile that with everything I was raised to believe. The Sylvari have avoided violence for millennia, have built our entire civilization on the principle that there is always a better way than bloodshed." Jake reached out and took one of her hands in his grip weak but steady. "You did what you had to do," he said. "You protected someone who needed protecting, and there is no shame in that. The universe is full of beings who would hurt the innocent, and sometimes the only way to stop them is to fight back." Volanthi looked at their joined hands, her expression thoughtful. "Commander Sorathen has been relieved of his duties," she said. "He and the other guards who fled will face judgment for their actions. They followed our traditions, our laws, our cultural beliefs. But I have come to understand that traditions which require us to abandon those who trust us are traditions that deserve to be questioned." She raised her eyes to meet his, and Jake saw something new there, something that had not existed before that terrible night. Strength. "I have already begun reforms to the Vanther Guard," the Queen continued. "They will be retrained by human instructors, taught not just how to fight, but why fighting matters. They will learn what it means to stand with someone until the end, to never abandon a charge no matter the cost." Jake absorbed this information with a mixture of pride and concern. "I imagine that will make me pretty unpopular around here," he said. The Queen smiled, and the expression transformed her face in a way that made Jake's heart skip a beat. "You are already popular, Jake Morrison," she said. "The story of what happened that night has spread across the galaxy. Every species in the Galactic Union knows that when the guards fled, one human remained. One human who killed 17 elite Korath assassins, who held off an army with nothing but determination and courage, who would have given his life to protect someone he barely knew." She squeezed his hand gently, "You are a hero to my people," she said, "but more than that, you have given us a gift that we lost long ago. You have shown us that some things are worth fighting for, that there is honor in standing when others run, that loyalty can be stronger than logic." Jake felt heat rising in his cheeks and looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "I was just doing my job," he mumbled. "No," Valanthe said firmly. "You were doing what humans do, and that is something far more remarkable than simply following orders." She released his hand and rose from her chair, her forearms spreading in a gesture that Jake had come to recognize as a sign of deep respect. "The Korath Dominion wanted to send a message by killing me," she said. "They wanted to show the galaxy that the Sylvari were weak, that our alliance with humanity was meaningless, that we could be conquered without consequence." Her silver eyes blazed with a fire that Jake had never seen before. "Instead, humanity sent a different message," she continued, "a message that was louder and clearer and far more terrifying to those who would threaten the innocent. The message was simple: humans do not abandon their friends, and anyone who attacks the Sylvari Empire will have to answer to them." She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. "Rest, Jake Morrison," she said, her voice warm with affection. "Recover your strength. When you are healed, there will be much work to do. The galaxy is changing, and I want you at my side when it does." Jake watched her go, this ancient queen who had been transformed by a single night of fire and blood, and he felt something stirring in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. Hope. Hope for the future. Hope for the Alliance. Hope for a galaxy where species like the Sylvari and humanity could stand together against the darkness. He closed his eyes and let the healing technology do its work, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to truly rest. Outside the medical bay, Queen Valanthe walked through the corridors of her palace with a new purpose in her step. She passed the places where Jake had fought and bled and nearly died, and she remembered every moment of that terrible night with perfect clarity. The Sylvari had survived for millennia, through wisdom and patience and careful neutrality. But the universe was changing, and the old ways were no longer enough. There were predators out there, species like the Korath, who respected only strength, and the Sylvari would have to adapt or perish. But they would not adapt alone. The alliance with humanity had been intended as a political gesture, a symbolic partnership that would deter aggression without requiring actual sacrifice. Now it had become something far more significant, a true bond forged in blood and fire, and the stubborn refusal of one man to abandon someone who needed him. The Galactic Union would remember this night. They would remember that humanity did not measure the value of a life by its political importance, that humans would fight and die for principles that other species considered inefficient and illogical. And perhaps, in time, other species would learn from their example. The twin moons had set and the sun was rising over the capital city, its light washing away the last shadows of the night and revealing a world that had been forever changed. Queen Valanthe of the Sylvari Empire stood at her window and watched the dawn, and she thought about a human named Jake Morrison who had taught her what loyalty truly meant. She thought about the future they would build together, and for the first time in her long reign, she was not afraid.